Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. Have you been watching the cabinet picks of President-elect Trump with a mixture of fascination and incomprehension? According to some parts of the media, every one of them is either scandalously underqualified or a danger to democracy. According to Trump media, they're either brilliant or sellouts, not Trumpy enough. Well, if you're looking for something like a fair assessment of who they are, what they might be like, including whether they actually stand a chance of being confirmed, look no further. I have UnHerd's Emily Jashinsky on the line from our DC bureau to try to help us do just that. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Freddie. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. So we have been watching all around the world, I think, over the past few weeks to see what the Trump administration was going to be like. A lot of names have been talked about, and a lot of people may not know much about them. Some of them are more kind of discussed, well-known characters, and some of them will be new to some people. So I'm hoping in the course of the next half hour, you can give us a bit of a crash tutorial on some of these names and just how controversial, how out there, or maybe kind of inspired in some cases, the choices may be.
It's a really interesting group of people that reflects the coalition Donald Trump cobbled together over the course of his last presidential run. People in conservative circles are very conscious of not repeating what they see as mistakes of the first Trump administration, not having loyalists, not having people prepared to take tough decisions on day one of a potential administration. So Donald Trump is definitely taking steps towards correcting, again, what a lot of people have seen as those errors when he takes office in January.
Let's start with Marco Rubio. He probably is among the better known names. A senator out of Florida. He ran against Donald Trump for the Republican nomination in 2016. At that stage, as I recall, he wasn't a big fan of Donald Trump, but he's kind of moved, as so many Republicans have, over the subsequent 8 years and now finds himself nominated as Secretary of State. Is he an establishment choice?
Yes, Marco Rubio is one of the more disappointing choices for MAGA enthusiasts because Marco Rubio's record on foreign policy, which of course he will oversee as Secretary of State if he's confirmed, which he is very likely to be confirmed, his portfolio will be entirely foreign policy. And when you go back to conflicts, be they in Latin America or the Middle East or in Europe, frankly, there are a lot of people in the MAGA camp. Reportedly, Tucker Carlson was lobbying against Marco Rubio, for instance, who think he's too hawkish, who will call him a neoconservative. Now, I think the neoconservative label used pejoratively against Marco Rubio lacks a little bit of nuance. He did vote against the most recent spring Ukraine aid package in the Senate. Skeptics will point out he did that for reasons that may not have been genuine sort of skepticism about the continuing U.S. involvement in that conflict. But he has been willing, not just on economics, most notably on economics. He's definitely said openly, he wrote an entire book called Decades of Decadence about why he learned that the Tea Party wave economics that he was elected on actually were kind of failing the American people. He's had flexibility there. I think he's had a little bit of flexibility on foreign policy, but especially in Latin America, he's the son of Cuban immigrants. He's very, very hawkish, very pro-intervention, and people in MAGA circles definitely are concerned that will lead to more hawkishness in Ukraine, in the Middle East, for example. They see that as a real vulnerability for the MAGA agenda.
Do you think it's fair to think of him almost as the kind of version 2 of a neocon, which is pretty much into conflict or a standoff against China, but keen to back out of the Ukraine situation? That seems to be a lot of the people around Donald Trump are headed in that direction, and Rubio seems to be as well.
Well, and here in DC, Marco Rubio surrounds himself with the people that fit that exact profile, who are very hawkish on China, probably still very hawkish in Latin America, so support sanctions in Venezuela and Cuba, but are realist when it comes to NATO and Europe. And, Tulsi Gabbard is someone who on July 14th, I believe, before Donald Trump announced J.D. Vance as his running mate, Tulsi Gabbard went on Megyn Kelly's show and slammed Marco Rubio in the harshest possible terms. And now if Tulsi Gabbard is confirmed, which we'll talk about in a moment, she would be the director of national intelligence. So in the highest possible intelligence office, with the sort of much, much more isolationist and skeptical perspective on all of this, even though I think it's much more accurate to say that Marco Rubio is on a journey from the neoconservative wing of the Republican Party to what you described, maybe round 2 of neoconservatism, which is learning from the mistakes of the global war on terrorism that people are more openly willing to talk about now. And someone else who fits that we're going to talk about is Pete Hegseth. So Trump is assembling a coalition of people who are already fully reckoned with what a lot of people, most people in America, see as the errors of the war on terrorism, and people who are sort of trying to be the bridge between both the prior conservative foreign policy and the future.
On Israel, however, and we'll move on from Rubio in a moment, but on Israel, he is absolutely solid, right? And that is the feature of most, maybe not all, but most of these picks from President-elect Trump.
Rock solid. The same actually applies really to Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Hegseth. And I think, Trump named Mike Huckabee as his ambassador to Israel. Mike Huckabee has never wavered for a moment from the staunch conservative position, hawkish position on Israel, hawkish position, of course, towards Iran. Rubio's also very, very hawkish towards Iran, not just China, but also towards Iran. He has been towards Putin. And so you can understand where that would be concerning to somebody like Tucker Carlson, who has become hypersensitive to the potential for nuclear conflict as some of these different spheres congeal when you have North Korean soldiers in Russia and you have Iran and Russia and Venezuela and all of those different pieces of the puzzle coming together. You can see where Tucker Carlson would be nervous about somebody who is as hawkish on Israel as Rubio, Hegseth, or even Tulsi Gabbard, who has really become very pro-Israel in recent months.
Well, let's talk about Tulsi. We seem to have moved on to her anyway. So she is the nominee for Director of National Intelligence. Talk about journeys. I mean, she's definitely been on a journey. She came out for Bernie Sanders in 2016. She was on the left of the Democratic Party. 2020, she ran to be the Democratic nominee. And now 2024, I think she was a Democrat even a year ago, wasn't she, technically, or certainly 2 years ago. And now she's a MAGA Republican. Tell us what we need to know about Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi Gabbard is such an interesting figure. And, she's made a lot of people mad on both the left and the right over the years, more on the left now than the right. But she really first came to prominence when she quit her position as vice chair of the Democratic Party. She was vice chair of the Democratic National Committee, and she quit over her protests about the way the DNC was treating Bernie Sanders during the 2016 election. That launched her into a position of national prominence, and it wasn't until this recent election cycle that she formally left the Democratic Party and joined hands with Donald Trump. One of the big reasons, of course, was foreign policy. She is very much in the realist camp. Some people might just call her an isolationist. I think that'd probably be unfair, but especially given her position on Israel, as we just talked about. But she's
anti-war. Is another way of
she's
describing
anti-war,
it.
but very hawkish on radical Islam and sort of Islamism. So that sort of creates different implications for her Middle East policy, where people may say it's inconsistent with her policy on Russia and Ukraine or her policy about interventionism elsewhere. So she's an interesting figure who's hard to sort of categorize in a black and white way. But one of the other issues besides foreign policy that pushed her towards the Republican Party was transgenderism. She talks about that a lot. It's not directly relevant to her position of Director of National Intelligence, but in terms of how we contextualize the journey that Tulsi Gabbard has been on, she's really someone who was a traditional women's right, dovish Democrat until not too long ago, and it became uncomfortable for her to be on the left. So that, I think, is going to severely hurt her chances of being confirmed by the Senate. Her position on U.S. intervention in Syria is going to be a load of baggage for her to deal with very neoconservative senators, actually senators in the Democratic and Republican Party, who have smeared her as a Putin asset, an agent of Assad for a long, long time. And there may be very fair criticisms of Tulsi Gabbard's position on Syria, but there's no love lost. These are deeply, deeply bitter relationships.
So it's not all going to be peace and kumbaya in the coming months. Let's bring in Pete Hegseth. Again, what we hear is that he's basically a TV producer. He's a TV presenter. He's a guy off Fox News, and the kind of image you're presented with is Donald Trump watching the TV and saying, I like that guy. He looks like a soldier. He talks about the right kind of things. Let's have him for defense secretary. It's straight out of central casting. This is, cabinet as a TV show.
Right. Well, yeah, Pete Hegseth was a host on Fox and Friends Weekend, and that's where people really know him from. But he did go to Princeton undergraduate, Harvard Kennedy School for a master's, and he then went enlisted. He served in Iraq and Afghanistan and is a decorated veteran. He has 2 Bronze Stars, came back and started working on veterans advocacy issues. So started working with a group called Concerned Vets for America that is definitely not very hawkish, is sort of, again, smeared as Tulsi Gabbard is, as kind of isolationist. And that's why one of his colleagues, Dan Caldwell, who worked with him at Concerned Veterans for America, has come out and said, if you're calling Pete Hegseth a neocon, you have no idea what you're talking about. But it's interesting because Hegseth, when he got back from the war, was ardently defending it in public. And he has openly then shifted. He has become disillusioned. I would call him hawkish, but disillusioned. He's not just a TV host. He's actually a very, very smart guy who has, I think, actually amassed a surprising amount of support from people. I mean, personally, when I saw Donald Trump's press release about naming Pete Hegseth to the Department of Defense, I thought it was kind of hilarious because it's so Trumpian to just say I'm plucking my favorite Fox and Friends host and putting him into the Pentagon. But I think people here do recognize Pete Hegseth as a more serious person. I've interviewed him. He's very, very smart, much more so than people expect from a lot of, TV hosts. So his chance of being confirmed, if we're on a scale to 10, I would say maybe a 7. He is now battling a rape accusation from several years ago in California. He was speaking at a local Republican event there. So he said, she said, the woman who was married claims that she was intoxicated and Hegseth raped her in a hotel room. He claims that it was consensual. So he's battling that right now. It is apparently making senators skittish about having to take a vote on him, but I'm sure it will make MAGA people dig their heels in much deeper because they'll say this is Brett Kavanaugh all over again.
Well, so you're saying he's intelligent and he's a serious person, and I don't dispute that. It does seem fair to raise an eyebrow nonetheless. I mean, in terms of CVs for Secretary of Defense, his is kind of thin. Normally, you have a little bit more on the CV than he has. I think that is fair to say, is it not?
Absolutely. And it's actually a pretty fair point of concern for people who want the Pentagon to be uprooted. Alyssa Farah, who worked for the Trump administration and is now a very anti-Trump host on The View, made, I thought, a pretty good point, though, about Hegseth coming into the Pentagon. She said there are generals that have actually worked in the Pentagon, have gone through the bureaucracy and tried to shake the Pentagon up, have tried to cut through the red tape and smash the bureaucracy, and have gotten eaten alive. So it's unlikely then that somebody who spent the bulk of his recent time in TV and writing books will be able to come in without being enmeshed in the Pentagon bureaucracy, without being in the kind of leadership structure, and know exactly how to dismantle it. I mean, this is a massive, massive department, and it's just an overwhelming prospect to really do much in a 4-year term as the head of the Defense Department. So it could actually even be a negative as to whether it has what it takes to make, even if you say he wants to make significant damage to the Pentagon, can you do that from the outside if you don't know where everything is? Totally relevant question.
It's an interesting point, actually, that all of these outsiders that watching from afar seem to signal a kind of anti-establishment desire to uproot everything and change everything from the inside, may actually not be able to do that because they don't know enough about the machine. They could be there for 4 years and by the end of it they still haven't got to grips with where the levers are, where the power lies. So you could kind of paradoxically make the argument that he would achieve more with more establishment cabinet picks.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's an argument that I know we'll talk about because it also applies to Matt Gaetz.
Let's talk about Matt then. You mentioned him, and there's another cloud hanging over Matt Gaetz. I mean, you mentioned there's a rape allegation in connection with Hegseth. The allegations with reference to Matt Gaetz are also pretty serious. What's the status on that? Before we move on to his actual CV, you get people who are kind of anti-Trump will make a lot of those allegations and say that this should be a disqualifying factor. People who defend him say, well, they have withdrawn the case. Apparently there wasn't enough evidence. What's a fair assessment of that?
Yeah, let's open this can of worms because Matt Gaetz is known in DC and even in Republican circles to be fairly sleazy, not just among anti-MAGA people, but even people in MAGA world understand that, especially before he was married, this guy parties very hard. Not entirely unusual in Congress, but Matt Gaetz was especially open about how much he was partying. And that's where this Department of Justice investigation stems from. He was making Venmo payments to two women who now accuse him of sleeping with them. One of them was underage. Their Venmo payments going back to, they accumulate to like $10,000 about, all kinds of different things that his, again, accusers say were related to underage, sex with underage women and trafficking. And the Department of Justice, even though they were investigating this, did ultimately drop the case. Now, one of Matt Gaetz's major accusers is actually one of his best friends, former best friends, a man named Joel Greenberg, who was a tax collector in Seminole County, Florida. This is all very Florida stuff. And Greenberg is now serving a prison sentence. He pleaded guilty to very, very serious charges, sex trafficking and the like. Greenberg accuses Gaetz of having sex with minors, of paying for sex, and of all of these different, very serious allegations. Greenberg, though, you can understand why people in MAGA camps would say is a wildly unreliable witness. He has admitted to making up smears about people's sex lives before, so he's definitely a hard person to say is perfectly credible, which is probably part of the reason why the Department of Justice, even though they were in a plea agreement with him, there was an inmate that was in prison with Joel Greenberg who said he told him that he had women. Greenberg told him he had women who would agree to lie about Matt Gaetz in exchange for money down the road. The women themselves, there are questions about their credibility. And even though the Department of Justice really wanted to get Matt Gaetz very hard, they ended up dropping the case. What's leaking out now is an ethics investigation that the House Ethics Committee was doing until Trump nominated Gaetz. He resigned just a couple of hours later. Thus, the House Ethics Committee, which was set to release this report in a couple of days' time, reportedly, had to drop it because Matt Gaetz was no longer a member of Congress. Now, the Senate is demanding to see that. Even Trump supportive senators are demanding to see that ethics report before Gaetz goes up for confirmation. So this is a very, very complicated and sordid story, but that ethics report has become the centerpiece of the debate over whether or not Gaetz should be or can be confirmed.
I mean, if I'm in the center of Trump world right now, trying to put together an administration on the back of this historic win, I think that cuts two ways, doesn't it? Either you think we are not going to be diverted by what you see as yet another partisan attack, it's like Justice Kavanaugh or whatever, and you feel like the whole principle of the Trump victory is not to give in to these kinds of partisan attacks, not to compromise with your opponents. I can see that argument being made inside Trump world. Surely the other argument is that they don't have time for this kind of distraction. Which of those two arguments do you think wins out if you're advising the president-elect?
We got a good indication yesterday from Trump himself, who was asked if he was reconsidering the Gaetz nomination, and he just said no. I think that will absolutely win out. Now, the question is whether he can. J.D. Vance is here in D.C. this week trying to make inroads for Matt Gaetz, making calls, taking meetings with senators, trying to make inroads for Gaetz to have a friendlier and smoother path to confirmation. We have seen certain people. Markwayne Mullin is a senator from Oklahoma. He's actually the senator who told CNN before Matt Gaetz was nominated, when the DOJ was investigating him, that Gaetz would show off pictures of the naked women he'd allegedly slept with on his phone when they were on the House floor. Markwayne Mullin said he supports Gaetz's nomination because he trusts Trump, that Trump was elected as a disruptor. So what that tells me is that the pitch that is being made by J.D. Vance and by Donald Trump himself and even by Matt Gaetz is working on senators. Whether, though, it's enough to get him over the confirmation threshold in such a closely divided Senate, I still don't see how the math works out for that. But they really are going to have to, promise to give people things and in exchange for confirming Matt Gaetz, because people really, really don't want to do it. Even MAGA-friendly people don't want to do it. The way they see this is two things can be true. The Department of Justice can badly need disruption and can badly need a shakeup three things can be true. The left can also be targeting Matt Gaetz. And thirdly, Matt Gaetz can be the wrong person for this job because of all of the distractions and because of all of the political capital it's going to take just to get him confirmed. Why not nominate Jim Jordan, somebody that won't have a rocky confirmation path? Get him in there, and he's substantively almost the same on all of these issues. So why not just do it that way? That's really the argument.
Why does Trump like Matt Gaetz so much? What is it about him that they think is worth this battle? Really spending valuable political capital already, trying to, horse trade with senators, trying to smooth his passage. Why spend it on Matt Gaetz?
Precisely because of everything we've just talked about, precisely because Matt Gaetz was targeted by the Department of Justice. They dropped their allegations. They were leaking the whole time, though, and has become definitely an enemy of what people in MAGA world refer to as the deep state. That is exactly why Trump and his allies are so deeply attached to Matt Gaetz, because Matt Gaetz has become one of the harshest critics of the Department of Justice. He was extremely unwaveringly pro-Trump during the Russia collusion investigation. He was very friendly with conservative media during that time. He was always ardently defensive of Donald Trump. He's also very solid across policies in kind of the MAGA agenda. He's very, very populist on antitrust. He's very much against excessive surveillance and what he sees as unconstitutional surveillance. And that is really popular with people in Trump world who want to say things like FISA. So that's the FISA courts that came out of the Church Committee hearings back in the 1970s to cut down the 1970s to cut down on illegal surveillance of American citizens. That's near and dear to MAGA voters' hearts and near and dear to Trump's heart, because obviously his campaign was targeted in ways that even the DOJ has admitted were improper. So it's precisely Matt Gaetz's enmity towards the DOJ that makes him so beloved by Trump world.
So they think he's a radical, and you need someone that kind of out there to make such a radical agenda happen. The opponents, however, say that he is being put in place to pursue political prosecutions, or basically, converting the Department of Justice into a political tool, such as they feel has been done against them by the Democratic side, right back at people who they don't like on the other side of the aisle. Is there any truth in that?
Yes, absolutely. The pledge that Donald Trump made to be, quote, retribution on the campaign trail is fulfilled in the form of Matt Gaetz, which again is why people in MAGA world like him, because the Department of Justice has myriad problems. They are plain to see. And the more the people at the Department of Justice, seen as like the careers, the bureaucrats, detest Matt Gaetz, the more it makes Donald Trump, even all of this hullabaloo, it makes Donald Trump more and more committed to trying to get Matt Gaetz through the Senate because they hate him so much. And yeah, I mean, that's basically where this is going to go. Is Matt Gaetz will openly, he won't hide. He won't say, oh, I'm just following the letter of the law. He will be somebody who is passionately and enthusiastically defending retribution on television, on X, on social media, on podcasts. When he is the attorney general, he will be out there saying, this is exactly what needs to happen. If he's confirmed, of course, he'll be saying, you did this to us. And that's how people in Trump world say you communicate to the American people who maybe don't know exactly how the DOJ was weaponized under Obama and under the Biden administration as they see it.
It would still be a big new step, wouldn't it, to have the Attorney General going on TV and openly talking about weaponizing the Justice Department against political enemies. It feels like we're a long way from an ideal liberal democracy at that point. I mean, am I being too, soggy centrist to say that? It feels like it might be a big step. Even if you can make those critiques of the Obama and Biden administrations, they didn't say the quiet part out loud. It's a whole new step.
It is. And this is the central debate on what is called the quote unquote new right. So I don't think it makes anybody a soggy centrist to have those concerns, which is that do you need a quote unquote red Caesar, as Michael Anton put it, in order to restore the health of the American Republic? There are a lot of people who think absolutely you need to go back in and fight fire with fire. Otherwise, you don't restore anything. You don't restore quote American greatness unless you're willing to fight fire with fire. I completely disagree with that. I think it careens us down a very, very slippery slope that is very real, and we're seeing it happen before our eyes. So I'm not convinced by that argument, but the new right itself is sort of split half and half on that question, and Gaetz has become a lightning rod for people on both sides.
So chances of him being confirmed, score out of 10?
I would right now give it a 5 because I just don't think the math works. I think Trump will be able to convince a lot of senators to get on board the Gaetz train. I don't know that ultimately he'll be able to convince enough of them to get on the Gaetz train.
Let's move on to health, because RFK, I'm not sure if you predicted it or not. He was talked about, and obviously there was the sense that they'd done a deal. He'd come on board the Trump campaign. He'd suspended his own independent presidential campaign. Obviously he was offered something. Actual Secretary for Health, was it a surprise to you?
Trump sort of took his time in naming Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to a cabinet nomination. And so there were, I think, open questions about whether that meant he was wavering and whether he was just going to make Kennedy a czar of some sort, which would be seen as a sort of demotion from a potential, obviously, cabinet position. One thing that I heard from a source in MAGA world, actually worked in the first Trump administration, is that Kennedy was the clear choice of DC MAGA people, that they wanted him really badly. And what I find interesting about that is it shows that the Make America Healthy Again and Make America Great Again marriage is complete. People who were formerly very opposed to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who, by the way, was under consideration by Barack Obama for the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. Obama considered nominating RFK Jr. for his cabinet back in 2008. Somebody who has said that climate deniers should be jailed, has very, very oppositional positions to a lot of his new colleagues in Trump world. He's actually now been totally folded into the camp, is very well liked, and is seen as somebody who's on the right track. So I wasn't entirely surprised by it, but if you take a step back and look at it from a 30,000 foot view, it is surprising to see people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard and Elon Musk surrounding Trump right now. I saw one funny post on X that put it this way: the Democrats did win the election. These are just not people, of course, that call themselves Democrats anymore, but it's still fairly unconventional for someone like Trump to nominate someone like Kennedy.
So what would we actually expect if Kennedy is confirmed? Obviously, his main objective would be to kind of root out the corruption as he sees it, to separate corporate interests from government health advice, to reduce dependence on chemicals and pharmaceuticals that he sees has gone completely wild over recent decades. All of those, a lot of people on the left or the right might just think are pretty laudable aims. The more controversial bit, I guess, comes with his attitude to vaccines, some of his more conspiratorial ideas. How do you judge RFK on the kind of sane to kook spectrum?
He's also sort of fascinating from the perspective that part of his approach to the regulatory patchwork in the United States, and especially the more time I think he spends around people like Elon Musk, is that the government is both doing way too much and way too little, which raises a $1 trillion question about, as the head of a regulatory agency, does he use the full weight of the government power, even in ways that he's before said are too heavy-handed? The government shouldn't have the right to tell you not to drink raw milk. Or does he actually try to take powers away from the agency? Because in some respects, he said it's not powerful enough. It's not using its regulatory power because it's captured by corporate interests. So it's very hard to know what a Kennedy HHS would look like, Health and Human Services Department would look like, because we've never really seen anybody like that before. In fact, Joe Biden had such a hard time finding somebody to head up his agencies that wasn't connected to the industry. He eventually just kind of gave up on his ability to find somebody who would be a good fit for these roles that doesn't have all of the kind of industry baggage. So I think this is totally uncharted territory. We know some of his pet issues: vaccines, fluoride. Obviously, I'm sure he still has a lot to do with COVID. Like, he still will want to do some regulations as it pertains to ongoing boosters. We know that those are some of his pet issues. Raw milk is another one. There are things that he's very clearly talked about for years that he wants to tackle. So we'll see. He's been talking a lot in conversations with MAGA people on the right about food safety, food health, and those are areas that Republicans are new to. So is there enough personnel to staff a RFK Jr. HHS in a way that makes sense? Another huge question. Like, will he even have the people to do what he wants to do? I don't know.
I mean, in terms of potential political fissures and tensions, this has got to be right up at the top of the list, I would have thought. I mean, you've got someone in RFK Jr. who is really a lifelong campaigner on race issues as well as environmental issues. He's a true believer on the climate agenda. Make no mistake, any kind of big departures that a Trump administration will want to do, from signing up to climate treaties, the whole kind of approach, RFK is going to struggle with that. And then you can imagine if Donald Trump does actually get serious about deporting illegal immigrants, and there are lots of scenes of people from different races being put into vans and shipped over the border, these could be very difficult moments for someone like RFK. He must have thought about this, but it's hard to see how it's hard to see how there won't be any tensions in the years to come.
It really is, because he shifted when he was courting Trump voters on the campaign trail, first as a Democratic candidate, then as an independent candidate, and then even as he was trying to support Trump on the campaign trail after he formally joined the campaign. He was talking a lot about his own shifts on immigration and transgender issues. And so he has been willing to say, okay, maybe I was wrong, and maybe the Republicans and Donald Trump himself are right on this question. I also wonder about those potential tensions, and I wonder about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a man who has spent his career dedicated to making sweeping radical changes, being given this post on a silver platter, if he can get confirmed, but being given this post on a silver platter, how many compromises will he make to keep that position? Because this is like his fantasy coming true. So how badly will he want to keep it? How many compromises will he have to make to keep it? Totally open question.
I mean, we've interviewed him on this show as well, and he definitely strikes me as an idealist, someone who is sincere. Whether you think he's right or not is a different question, but he's sincere in what he believes, and he has the huge weight of history on his shoulders, with the sense of, obviously, his father, his uncle, the whole Kennedy family, and what he kind of owes to his heritage, but also now he's embedded in Hollywood. His wife is a famous actor. He's got a whole load of pressures around him from there. So there will be a lot of pressures on an idealistic RFK.
And maybe he's able to animate some of those old connections with the left. Cory Booker, a very hard left Democratic establishment senator. I shouldn't say hard left in the sense that he's like Marxist. I mean that in the sense that he is a loyalist to the party, has since come out and said he's open-minded about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Marianne Williamson told us on Undercurrents that she's open-minded to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And she's sort of someone that's much further to the left than Cory Booker. But can those old ties be used by him when he gets into trouble, maybe with MAGA world, maybe with the establishment Republicans who are close with lobbyists in the pharma world and in the agricultural world? That's also really, really interesting. I'm very curious how that plays out too.
A little bit of a shout out to Dr. Oz. It's not technically a cabinet level post, so it shouldn't be in our discussion, but it was announced just, I think, today or yesterday. This is Mehmet Oz, who is another TV personality. We were saying it's kind of the TV cabinet. Tell us a little bit about him. Is this a kooky appointment, or is there some sense behind it?
Well, Dr. Oz is somebody who's a very very Trumpian pick, given that what Donald Trump reportedly wants, and understandably wants from his cabinet and his leaders, is an ability to defend policies and to defend him, frankly. And Dr. Oz ran for Senate in Pennsylvania and lost by a hair to John Fetterman last cycle. Obviously, Pennsylvania just swung red, and a lot of people thought that was a big missed opportunity, that should have been a pretty easy election for Republicans, especially given John Fetterman's health condition. But even, more broadly, Pennsylvania's political condition. Donald Trump won that state soundly this time around. And Oz was very loyal to Trump over the course of that race. And he has been very loyal to Trump. So this is not a super, super powerful position, but it is one in which he's overseeing very important programs for people here, Medicare and Medicaid.
So Mehmet Oz, very successful TV personality, he's going to be in charge of Medicare and Medicaid.
Right. Very important programs for seniors and people in poverty in the United States. And one thing that might be controversial and is worth watching for him, or he does have to get Senate confirmed, is whether or not his past idea about kind of privatizing Medicare, he's called it Medicare Advantage for all, which if you're in the US, you're familiar with Medicare Advantage and you know that it's sort of controversial. It's a step towards privatization. Does that hurt him? Donald Trump is very much in favor of protecting those programs. So does that become a source of tension? I think he'll get confirmed. But, obviously a big TV personality in the US compared to people like Oprah, a daytime television doctor. He'll come with some baggage, but a lot of that was already tested in the Senate race.
Education, another recent one in the last couple of days. Linda McMahon, apparently a Trump loyalist, someone with a business background, not someone especially connected to education, it's fair to say. Was that a surprising pick, do you think?
I was shocked by that. And my people in kind of conservative education circles were very surprised by it. It's not shocking, like from a big picture standpoint, because she is loyal to Trump. She was under consideration for Commerce Secretary. But when Donald Trump named Howard Lutnick to Commerce Secretary, somebody who had himself been in consideration for Treasury Secretary, he sort of slotted McMahon into the Education Secretary, which makes it feel kind of like a consolation prize, especially because she's not somebody like Betsy DeVos, who has dedicated her life to education policy. She's obviously had some overlap with it, but one thing my source said this morning is that nobody who works in the world of school choice, which is the most important conservative policy, voucher systems that education world on the right works on, they don't even really know her. They're not super familiar with her, which will make it very interesting when it comes time to staff the agency, frankly. But it does seem like this was kind of a consolation prize to a staunch Trump loyalist, somebody who was the head of his small business administration in his first time in office and has been out there on the trail for him. Her and her husband, Vince McMahon, are the brains behind WWE wrestling. So also kind of Trumpian and television related in that sense. But it seems like she kind of got stuck with education secretary, even though it's a very important position.
What does it tell us about Trump's attitude to education and that department? I mean, at one point in the campaign, there was an idea he might actually try to shut down the Department for Education and return all education policy to the states. Again, most people think that might not happen in reality. What does it say about how radical he's prepared to be on education that he picks someone so apparently kind of random for this post?
There are a lot of options in conservative world. Conservative think tanks and activist groups are stuffed to the brim with very radical people on education policy. The Heritage Foundation, for example, this was in Project 2025 and got a lot of attention, but the Heritage Foundation has been advocating for closing the Department of Education for decades, like going back to the 80s. Ronald Reagan got criticized for not closing the Department of Education down. So there are a lot of rock-ribbed people that would have, I think, an easier time doing that than somebody who's of course, they're WWE friendly, but they're very wealthy, kind of coastal, well-connected people, the McMahons. And do they have the stomach to take radical steps? I think there are other people who probably would have been much more terrifying to the left. And indeed, we've already seen Randy Weingarten come out and say, I'm open to learning more about what Linda McMahon thinks on education policy. And
what I'm hearing is that your contacts in Trump world think she's not Trumpy enough. This is an example of a cabinet pick that is not Trumpy enough.
It's interesting because it's like, what is Trumpy on education policy? Is it closing the Department of Education? Because he's had different approaches to it himself. I would say their perspective is that she's not conservative enough. She's not like a hardcore, dyed-in-the-wool, quote-unquote, movement conservative who's deeply passionate about education and has been working to close the Department of Education for decades. But Trump did telegraph in his statement that he was nominating her, she would, quote, return education to the states. So does that mean a full closure of the department? Does that mean a radical, aggressive, new embrace of federalism? It's kind of too early to tell, but she doesn't have the stomach that, a lot of people out there like Chris Rufo probably have.
Emily, there are a number of other big posts still to fill. I know we have a new Homeland Security Secretary nominee in the form of Kirsty Noem, Elise Stefanik, of course, Ambassador to the United Nations. And if we had more time, we'd talk about all of those. Of course, the Treasury Secretary is also open and may or may not be Bessent. There may be other candidates that are coming up in the coming days. But I wanted to use our final few moments to just zoom out a bit. In amongst all these names, there are a couple of other names that we haven't mentioned. That's Elon Musk and J.D. Vance. Neither of those are technically cabinet roles. J.D. Vance is obviously vice president-elect. He seems strangely absent at the moment. We see every day we get a new picture of Trump out on the road. He's going to a wrestling match with his best friend Elon. He's going to watch Elon's rocket launch. They're kind of inseparable, this new duo. And in the minds of voters who have been used to a Trump-Vance pairing, this might start to look a little bit like a Trump-Musk pairing. And frankly, it looks like Elon Musk is number 2 in the administration and Vance has been forgotten about. Is that wrong?
Well, it's quite interesting because J.D. Vance has been here in D.C. Not really. I mean, he has been down at Mar-a-Lago, of course. And his primary task right now seems to be absolutely convincing members of the Senate, he's a member of the Senate himself, to support these nominees. He's been working very, very hard to get the Senate to support Republican senators to support Matt Gaetz. He was in the Senate for the vote on new Senate leadership just last week. So he's working to sort of staff the administration, but also to embolden the Senate to create a smoother path for some of these unorthodox, unconventional, and controversial nominees. Elon Musk is apparently starting to rankle people in Trump circles. They've been leaking to the press that he just won't go away and he always seems around. We haven't quite seen Trump express that sentiment himself yet, though. He's, even as we're recording this, he's with Elon Musk at a SpaceX launch. So they're tied at the hip, seemingly. And Elon Musk has been lobbying for particular cabinet picks. Now, his pick of Howard Lutnick for Treasury Secretary, he publicly came out and said, I think Lutnick is the guy for this job. He's the disruptor. Trump did not go with Lutnick for Treasury Secretary. So how much influence Musk has, even though he's spending a lot of time around Trump, I don't know. I would imagine it's pretty significant. He's not going to have a formal appointment through the government. The DOGE, obviously the Department of Government Efficiency that he is now heading up with Vivek Ramaswamy, is going to be outside the U.S. government, and it will reportedly collaborate with the White House and the Office of Management and Budget.
I'm sorry, Emily, but that one I really struggle to swallow. The idea, we've created a department, clue is in the name, of government efficiency. That's department and government in the name of this body. And it's going to be outside government. I mean, and meanwhile, the head of it is going to be at the president's side all the time, is going to be on the calls with other world leaders like, Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine and others. Well, whilst Vance, by the way, is not on those calls, you struggle to sell that as being outside the government in any meaningful way.
It's amusing on a couple of levels. One, that they have announced a government agency to tackle redundancy in government by creating a redundant agency. There are already, of course, I would say not particularly well-functioning agencies, but there are agencies that exist to tackle these problems already. There are interdepartmental agencies that are working on this too. But the Government Accountability Office exists, for example. And it's somewhat amusing that at the top of this anti-redundancy department are 2 heads, but it's Trump, right? Like it's very unconventional. It's very just freewheeling, and Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, but especially Elon Musk, don't want to give up their business interests. And they would have to do that in order to go into any formal government situation. So I think the ethics of it are incredibly problematic. But I also am sure they're about to have a whole lot of fun here in Washington, Freddie.
Right, so if you're J.D. Vance and you thought you were number 2, or indeed if you're any other number of Trump loyalists who've been putting in the years, getting into his close favors, making sure that you had the ear of the future president, suddenly this new guy turns up, Elon Musk, and he's teacher's favorite, at least for now. You can imagine there'll be some plotting going on, and a lot of people might be a little bit disgruntled. Elon is going to most likely face some internal opposition.
Yeah, the fact that there are already leaks about that from Mar-a-Lago tells you what you need to know. That he's already starting to upset people in Trump circles. And one thing JD Vance understands very well, and Mike Pence understood it too, is that Donald Trump will pick up on someone who is overshadowing him or even creeping into that direction. So it's obviously a concern. It should be a concern of Elon Musk to not look like he's outshining the president himself, even though Elon Musk is wealthier and arguably more powerful given the breadth of all of his companies. Now, that's up for debate, but it's a fine line that Elon Musk will have to walk to not get on Trump's bad side simply for soaking up so much media attention. Lastly, though, I'll say the people I talk to in MAGA world are sort of like just all on the Elon bandwagon because they understand that he kind of opened up a new pathway towards different people for Republicans, that a lot of people who are fans of Elon Musk in tech world that have given to Democrats for a really long time, he helped them make those inroads and those relationships, definitely helped them with young men and gave them so much money just in the last few months of the election that they are kind of like attached to Elon now and loyal to Elon now too. Even the money alone was enough to kind of buy their love.
Emily, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Freddie.
That was Emily Jashinsky, the DC correspondent of UnHerd, joining us from the UnHerd bureau there and giving a crash course in Donald Trump's cabinet, at least his cabinet so far, whether they're likely to be confirmed, whether they're popular, crucially, inside MAGA world, which Emily has pretty unique access to. So I found that very informative and interesting as ever. Thank you to her. Thanks to you for tuning in. This was UnHerd.